changed a few things. I showed you that it ran in the last video, but it wasn't running right. I had thought that it was a throttle position sensor, but it wasn't, because that wasn't made the way that I thought it was. I changed, I'm thinking that's a MAF or a map. It's probably a map. A vacuum line hooked up to it, and it's hooked up to the harness. Whatever it is, the original one, see how that firewall's bent? The hose has a brass nipple inside of it, and when it bent the firewall, it rammed that nipple into that pipe, into that plate, and it must have broke something inside of it, because if that vacuum line was hooked up or it wasn't hooked up, it didn't change a thing. It stayed the same. So I took the one off that 89, and you can kind of tell it's sun bleached and stuff because it spent 8 years with no hood. Hooked it up, bolted it up, and kind of turned it a little bit so it wouldn't be against that plate, and cranked it, and it didn't do that anymore. It quit flooding. It started running good. One thing I didn't show you is in the previous video, I mentioned that I had to change the fuel injector. As you can see, I had to grind a slot in both of those screws. They're Phillips, and from the factory, they put blue Loctite on them. And then they corroded in too, so the only way I could turn that was take a cut-off wheel and grind a pretty deep slot in the screws and then just back them out. Then I snugged them back up. I got a surprise for you. Yeah. Parts. Yeah. I got the back bumper, tail lights, all that stuff back on. I realized it really didn't have much wrong with it. It just actually wasn't on. It was about half falling off. You can see over here I got all this to fit. It still doesn't fit very good over here. It fits like that because this car was rear-ended. The trunk lid didn't fit right, didn't shut right, rattled, everything else. It was because these hinges were pushed in when it was ready. So instead of blocking it with a piece of wood and just kind of bending them, they tried to adjust the trunk lid. And you're not going to adjust something when it's like that and beat the latch down and everything else. And I got up here, put that latch, put the screws back in the hinges where they originally were, and bent the hinges back, and then got back here and cut and welded the latch so it would actually draw down all the way. That gets the back of the car to where it can be driven. The parts car that I showed you already kind of gave up some parts. The nut and washer was missing off this control arm and the ball joint bolt. That parts car also had a radiator. I want to try to run this one a little while. If it ends up causing me a problem, I'll just change it. You know, before I didn't have one, so I made one work. We're on the road. Got a kind of a square tire, but that's kind of expected. And you can't see out of this car at all. This is terrible. I can see better through the camera than I can through the windshield. You're literally driving with me, people. We ride a little stiff, but it's, I mean, considering it hasn't been on the road in 7 years, I didn't check anything to do with the brakes. We did a quick tape measure alignment. The steering wheel's off a little bit. Horn works. It's a good running car. I put an exhaust on it. I'll show you a little bit of that here in a minute. But not bad for a first drive. I'll be back here in a second. All right, we drove it. It did okay. I mean, it kind of was the first time the car had been on the road in 7 years. And kind of was never meant to be back on the road ever again. Kind of small victories. What I wanted to show you is an exhaust here. Kind of, I just had to do it, man. We got side exit exhaust. It has a catalytic converter, and it has one singular resonator. So manifold, cat, cherry bomb, side pop. Yeah, it's really not that loud because it still has the converter. Does seem to let out a little bit of smoke. You know, I think I mentioned it in the previous video with quotations, rebuild. Well, they might have put rings in it, but more than likely, the ring lands were wore out too. So, if they even did put rings in it, it still smokes some. So, it either needed rings and pistons, which I would guess it probably needed pistons, and that might actually still need valve seals. Who knows? But it only really smokes if you lay into it. So, still pretty good. Car that burns a little tickle of oil, that's fine. That might keep the exhaust from rusting. If it blows up, I'll rebuild it. But runs fine. Shifts okay. Wouldn't be. It's not a shocker that it does kind of have trouble downshifting in the second gear, but because that was very common in those transmissions if they've ever been beat on. So either way, it shifts normal, fine. Didn't show you any of this, and I'm sorry, but the shifter These cars don't have a cable. They have rods. And one of them bolts to the transmission solid with a rubber bushing and is just welded to the plate back here. And the other one is what twists when you do this and goes forward and back when you do this. Since they're rods, I had to, you can't see it, I had to drill holes back 1 inch for the shifter to mount, because it was back further than the hole was, which means that the engine and transmission is back exactly 1 inch. I couldn't imagine why. That wasn't that big a deal. I just kind of drilled it out and cut the floor some and bolted it up. Anyway, now we have a shifter. The exhaust was the same situation, but the exhaust lined up with the first mount because it was back too. So manifold, it lined up to this rubber. Right in here, I had to cut it underneath the car and shorten it 1 inch and weld it back together, because the rear mount didn't line up with this one. It's too long. That's really not that big a deal, and it's really not that big a surprise. The car was wrecked hard, you know. But either way, like I mentioned in that driving video, we did a little bit of a tape measure alignment and just kind of put it on the road, and it runs and drives. So I'm very happy with that result. I'm going to end this video here. So I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.